Hey there, sports history fans. Artie Chapman of Fantasy Football Origin Stories here to tell you about a new way to play fantasy football this upcoming season. Tailgate Fantasy Sports is the game you've been waiting for. It's a new type of fantasy football that's totally free and easy to play. Just sign up with your email, pick your favorite NFL team, and set a 3-man lineup using only players from that team. Rotate 2 players each week and add power-ups to boost your players' scores. The best part? One random power-up drops every week. Now, it's not going to replace your existing leagues. In fact, it might be the way to get some of your favorite players on your home team. Because we all know how hard it is to get your hometown team's players in your home league, right? That is, if you truly follow some semblance of an ADP. I mean, come on. You think I'm getting Amon-Ra, the sun god, at market value in my home league? Pick number 7? You gotta be kidding me, dude. Get all the rules over at tailgatefantasysports.com. But the real action happens at tailgatefantasy.io. Tailgate Fantasy Sports, where true fans rule the game. Join now and help us put the word fan back into fantasy football.
One of the most interesting franchises in football history the last 60 years has got to be the Buffalo Bills franchise. From the AFL to some championships to some low points and some gut-punching moments you wouldn't wish upon your worst enemy. The story of the Buffalo Bills has been captured in a recent book by Bud Bailey and Greg Tranter, and they joined us in this episode to tell us all about Bills history in their new book, The Buffalo Bills Timeline. Coming up in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history on a day-to-day basis. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time. So as we come out of the tunnel of the Sports History Network, let's take the field and go no huddle through the portal of positive gridiron history with pigskindispatch.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of pigskindispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history. And gosh, we have a great episode today. We're going to be talking again about the Buffalo Bills. We just talked about them a couple days ago with Del Reed, and we're going to get into their history today of the franchise. We have a great book out by 2 authors that are friends of mine. And the title of the book is The Buffalo Bills, an illustrated timeline of storied team. I'd like to welcome in Greg Tranter and Bud Bailey. Welcome to the Pig Pen.
Hey, thanks, Darren.
Thank you, Darren. It's great to be here.
Gentlemen, you have this the title of an illustrated timeline of storied team. And I told you before we came on, I didn't really appreciate that title when I saw the cover of the book. When I sat down later and opened it up, it's exactly what it says. It's a timeline of Bills in chronological order, their whole history all the way up to recent times. Great job on that. And how did the concept of this come about, Greg?
Well, the design of the book actually came from the publisher. So Reedy Press had actually reached out to an author friend of both of ours, Jeff Miller, who you know. Jeff didn't have time to do the book, so he called Bud, or he told Reedy to call Bud, and they did. And then Bud engaged with me, so the two of us could work together on it. But the design of the book, the layout, we were kind of put into the structure. It's 176 pages. It's about short stories of the most important moments in Bills history. So there's 141 short stories that are between 150 words and 500 words. And each of them is illustrated with a photograph or multiple photographs to kind of bring each of the stories to light. So we followed their model, but we had all the flexibility we wanted pretty much to pick the stories.
Yeah, very, very well done. Now, Bud, we haven't had you on the show before, and we'd like to do with our listeners is let them know a little bit about who we're talking to. So maybe if you could give us a brief background of what you do to get you to the point of writing a book on a National Football League team.
Let's see. How much time we got? Oh, as much as I want. Okay. My relationship with football started in the early 60s. We lived in Wayne, New Jersey, and a friend of my father's moved out of town and didn't want to give up his New York Giants season tickets completely because he thought he might move back, but he gave them to us as a loan in 1962 and 63 when the Giants won the Eastern Division both years. And then so we went all the time as a family. Various combinations of people went. And then the guy moved back to New Jersey, and we had to give up the tickets, which no member of the Bailey family ever forgave him for that. In 65, we moved to Elmira, not knowing that just down the road from there in upstate New York was Greg Tranter, and would team up years and years later. And then that was my first exposure to Buffalo sports, because Elmira had cable TV and got Channel 4 WBEN. And who's the sportscaster there at the time? Van Miller, fresh off describing one AFL title in 1965, and he was going to do another one. And then as fate worked out, we moved to Buffalo in 1970. And of course, you moved to Buffalo as a teenager, as I did. I was 14 when we got here. And there's a guy named O.J. Simpson and an NFL team, which was not in Elmira, believe me. And anybody becomes a fan of O.J. Simpson and the Bills in that circumstance, even though the Bills took a while to get good. And here we are 53 years later. I'm in Buffalo. I went to Syracuse and have stayed in the sports business in various configurations. I worked for 23 years at the Buffalo News before retiring 6 years ago. And now I've been doing all sorts of projects in retirement, quote unquote. And one of them is watching over 3 books, which are coming out this year. The Bills were the first one and a couple more to go. So I'm waiting for the goofing off part of retirement, but it's been a lot of fun to do this stuff.
Yeah, it sounds like maybe you're doing more writing now in retirement than you did prior to that.
Different sort of work, and more and better. You know, there's only so much you can say about a boys soccer Class D game in Ellicottville.
Wow, that's a great story, and definitely some great credentials to help you write a book here with a guy that needs no introduction. Has been on here a bunch of times with Greg Tranter, with having all this experience of football history. So, how did Greg? How did you guys go about writing it? Having 2 people writing about the same subject. Did you take turns between the 141, or sort of split it down the middle, or how did that whole work out?
Yeah, it was really kind of interesting. We really started with trying to identify, are we aligned around the stories? And so we both made up a long list of what were the stories that we thought belonged in the book. And believe it or not, they were almost 100% aligned. With maybe Bud had 4 or 5 I wasn't thinking about, and I might have had 4 or 5 he wasn't thinking about. And then what we did was we didn't really divide them up. We just started writing where our energy went. And so I was writing stories I liked, and he was writing stories he liked, but we were trading them back and forth. So I'd write a story, he'd edit it and review it. He'd write a story, and I would do the same thing. And so it worked out, really well. And there weren't actually many stories that we had any kind of like fundamental disagreement about. It was really interesting. I think part of that was because we've lived almost all of this. There's very few stories that we haven't experienced in some way, shape, or form before this book came about.
Darren, if I could jump in on that, one of the funny things about this book was we knew how many pages it was going to be. It was 176 pages. We didn't know when the season was going to end, and we knew it was probably going to be a good season, but we didn't know how long the Bills were going to be playing. And the catch was the book's manuscript was due essentially when the Bills season was over, because they wanted to get it out as soon as possible. So we had to write enough stories so that if the Bills missed the playoffs, we would still be okay in terms of filling the 176 pages. But if the Bills had gone on to win the Super Bowl, we would have had to add a couple pages for an AFC Championship game, 3 or 4 pages on a Super Bowl, and 2 or 3 or 4 pages more on a parade, of course, because you got to have pictures of the parade if you're selling a commemorative book like that. So we had to have stories that were done but never seen. So we wrote extra stories. I think we wound up with 12 extra ones that we still didn't use, even though the Bill season was relatively long, but not as long as it could have been. So we wound up taking some stories and throwing them in the basket, and I've been publishing them on a website called Buffalo Sports Page, just to get them out there because I hate to see anything wasted. But today, for example, we had a story on the Bills' last game in the American Football League in 1969. And I think they lost like 48-6 or something, some horrible score. It was certainly not the way to go out from a Buffalo standpoint. So it was kind of funny how we just, wrote, and all right, this will work out somehow. And you'd rather have too much than too little.
So it was already predetermined which articles were going to hit the cutting room floor should the Bills keep going on in the playoffs. Did you guys have
an idea? Yeah, right.
Okay.
And I should add, the publisher had a few 2 cents to throw in as well about certain things. The Whammy Weenie story didn't make the book, unfortunately.
I think Greg shared that story with us with one of the
it's in the Relics book. Yes.
Yeah, in the Relics, right.
Book.
Right. Now, Greg, there has been some great eras that you guys covered of Buffalo Bills history. Starting in the AFL in the 60s, it had, the OJ years, of course, the great 90s years, and, and today, some great teams today, and a lot of in between. Is there one particular era of the Bills that you were sort of drawn to in writing this book?
Well, I mean, I think that because I was a kid at the time, and even the alumni will tell you it's the only 2 championships the Bills have won. We're 64 and 65. So I think I was drawn, to those stories. I love Jack Kemp. I was, of course, an 8, 9, 10-year-old when they were winning those. So it was, very, open in my mind right then and there. It really happened, and you're a kid, and it's bigger than life. And I thought that the Bills did some remarkable things. Then they went 17 games without allowing a rushing touchdown, when that's how you scored touchdowns in those days. They had the first soccer-style kicker in NFL history. They had a punter that really created the coffin corner, and Paul McGuire. They had Cookie Gilchrist, who, Larry Felser, who's a renowned Hall of Fame writer, claimed was was better than Jim Brown. So it was, quite the team. And just disappointed in looking back that they never had a chance to compete against the NFL, in Super Bowls at the end of those 2 seasons.
But I'll put the same question to you. Are you in agreement with Greg about that era, or was there a particular era or team that you really enjoyed writing about the most?
It's funny, Darren, because I tend to approach these things more like a journalist than Greg, who's more of a fan, even though we kind of overlap in some areas. But to me, like, obviously the Super Bowl years in the early 90s were incredibly exciting for Buffalo football and a high point, because I don't think anyone's ever going to make 4 straight Super Bowls again, at least in my lifetime. So what I liked about the format is we had a chance to explore other areas besides those obvious ones. Because pick up a book on Bills history, yeah, you're going to read about wide right and the comeback game against the Oilers and so forth. But since we had small, medium, and large stories, we could put in other areas, and some of them are silly, and some of them are about the bad times, and those are interesting as well, just because it's not easy to win in the NFL, and sometimes things just fall apart, and for whatever reason, and certain developments happen out of those games, and it's always an ongoing story in the NFL. And I think that's what people might like about this book, the fact that everybody remembers those Super Bowls and can recite them, but some of the coaching changes and Greg Williams and the trade for Sammy Watkins, or go on down the list. There's a lot of things that were crucial in the way the Bills turned out, but aren't that well known now, just because the team wasn't winning and people weren't paying as close attention.
You guys definitely snuck some really good little stories in some of these things that I didn't know or wasn't aware of or had forgotten, and we'll get to some of those here in a moment. But first, I want to ask a question and sort of air a beef I had about the book. Now, I'm from Western Pennsylvania, so I'm a Steelers fan. I think I counted, you had 3 times where you mentioned these victories over the Steelers. I think you had more than you had over the Dolphins in New England, if my count is right.
If we had listed all the Steelers' wins over the Bills in games, it would have had to been a 300-page book, because traditionally they'd go down to Pittsburgh on Monday night and get clobbered. Jim Kelly would go there trying to show off his abilities to the old fans, and the Steelers would just destroy them. Kelly would wind up 6 for 24 with 4 interceptions or whatever it is. It was there were an awful lot of mismatches there, so I wouldn't complain too much about those 3 little wins.
No, I'm joking, of course. I mean, I really enjoyed it, especially I grew up in the 70s and loved that team, just like you guys love your Bills teams. And but just to even hearing a loss when you guys had, I think the title was like the day they shredded the Steel Curtain or something. That was the title. And just looking back, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that when OJ had that big day, and he just brought back some fond memories and not so fond memories in that case. But a great job on that. Now, Greg, this question is for you. Now, I found myself reading the book, and I read it, and then I went back, and the pages I kept going back to were those AFL teams. Maybe it's because it's the most ones I'm not most familiar with. I don't remember the AFL. I was a little too young or not born when they were at. But some of those, the Cookie Gilchrist stories, but one in particular that really caught my eye was the Bills' first coach, and maybe you could speak on Buster Ramsey a little bit for us.
Yeah, well, of course, as I think and many of your listeners will know, Ralph Wilson was a part owner of the Lions before he invested in the Bills, and in fact, he and his father were season ticket holders of the Lions going all the way back to the mid 1930s. So he had been a Lions fan for a long, long time. So he brought blue and silver, the colors of the Lions, to Buffalo. He also brought the Lions defensive coordinator, Buster Ramsey, who becomes the head coach of the Bills. He was the Lions defensive coordinator. And of course, they won some championships in the late 50s, with Ramsey on the staff. So I think Ralph was quite pleased that he could get a coach of that magnitude to come to the AFL and to lead his franchise. And of course, back in those days, Ramsey was one of those, kind of like Vince Lombardi. It's my way or the highway, very emotional, screaming, hollering type of coach. And of course, he only lasted the first 2 years of the franchise because he couldn't really put an offensive team together. Their defenses weren't bad in those first couple of years, but they had trouble with finding a quarterback. And therefore had trouble, even back then, winning games without a quarterback that was very good. But it was a good way to start the franchise, and obviously Lou Saban coming, changes the fortunes of the team. But Buster was number one.
But question for you now, going back to that same era. We talked about Cookie Gilchrist a little bit. Now, I never watched him play. What kind of a runner was Cookie Gilchrist?
Well, getting back to Larry Felser, who I worked with for many years at the Buffalo News, he said that Cookie Gilchrist could have played any position on the field. He even kicked extra points at times for the Bills. About 6'3", 240, and he just ran you over. Not too subtle, but extremely powerful man, and just similar to, I guess, Jim Brown in that sense, a guy who could just take over a game. He came with some baggage. He was quite a personality and remained so right until the day he died. But boy, what a package! And he only, what did he stay here, about 3 years, Greg? What was it?
Yeah,
it was traded for
3.
They just got a little tired of working with him, but it was 3 good years, and he's in the Buffalo Sports Hall of Fame, Greater Buffalo Sports Hall of Fame, on those 3 years, which is pretty unusual for a guy to have such a short stay. But he was such a legend that he was voted in.
I mean, he even had a card that on the side of it said, "Looky, looky, here comes Cookie."
That's pretty good. You know who's coming then, don't you? Now, Greg, one of the subjects that you cover in there is the AFL-NFL merger. And the Bills, of course, were started off in the AFL. And how was that received in Buffalo, becoming a National Football League franchise from being in the AFL?
Well, I mean, it was almost like dying and going to heaven because Buffalo had tried to get in the NFL a number of times, really going all the way back to when War Memorial Stadium was built back in the late 30s. In fact, one of the interesting things is most people don't know that Buffalo hosted more neutral site NFL games than any stadium in NFL history, 27 games, where they hosted preseason games and even 7 regular season games, all with the idea of, geez, if we host games, maybe we'll get a franchise. And they were promised multiple times by the NFL that they would get into the NFL and never did. And then, of course, when the AFL comes, many leagues had failed before that Buffalo had a franchise in. So, what's the likelihood the AFL is going to succeed? And of course, until they signed the TV contract, which we also cover in the book, until they signed the TV contract in '64, the league is on shaky financial footing. And Ralph Wilson helped, keep 2 teams afloat by loaning them money to make sure that the AFL had an 8-team league. So when the merger happens, it's like, oh my God, Buffalo, we're a major league now. We're a major league city. We have an NFL team. It's like, wow, that's almost too hard to believe.
Darren, let me just jump in. One story, I'm not sure if it's in the book, but Lamar Hunt, noted rich guy, for lack of a better word, and really the guy who had the idea of the AFL in the first place, went to the NFL and said, I'm interested in an expansion team, and was told by the commissioner, Bert Bell, that if there's going to be an expansion, the first team will go to Buffalo. And so Hunt got kind of upset and walked out of the room and said, well, I'll just start my own league, darn it. And did it. Buffalo wound up getting a team because Wilson couldn't get a team in Miami, couldn't get the rights to the Orange Bowl, and was told Buffalo would be receptive. And here we are.
Wow. Okay. I wasn't aware of that story. That's great. Greg, I got a question for you. All right. Out of all the coaches that you had over Buffalo Bills history, and you covered, I think, all of them in the book, which one was the most anticipated when that was hired? Which one brought the most excitement to the Buffalo fandom? And you have some great selections.
I think without question it would be Chuck Knox, because if you think about it, Ralph Wilson never hired big name coaches. Marv Levy wasn't a big name coach when he hired him. Sean McDermott wasn't a big name coach. Lou Saban wasn't a big name coach. He had failed in Boston. So he had never, in fact, it's one of the criticisms of his ownership in that he wouldn't invest big money in coaches. The only time he did was Chuck Knox. And Chuck Knox was coming off, 5 or 6 consecutive Western Division championships, Western Division titles. His criticism was, the owner didn't like it because he thought they were too conservative and they didn't get to a Super Bowl. But the Rams were consistently winners the entire time he was there. In fact, everywhere Knox went, he won. He won in Seattle, and he came to Buffalo and won. And so the anticipation when he was hired was, oh my God, we're going to get good. And we did. I mean, he was hired in 1978, and 2 years later, we win our first Eastern Division crown in the NFL. Because when we joined in 1970, we had not won an AFC East Division title until 1980 with Chuck Knox. And so that was by far, I think, the most anticipated coach hiring.
All right, but I got a similar question for you. I'm going to start it off, though. Probably, I'd have to guess O.J. Simpson was probably the most anticipated player coming in, probably raise the excitement. So
Simpson or Kelly?
So, okay, but I guess maybe that's going to answer my question. I was going to ask you, what other player besides O.J. would be that? And you think is Jim Kelly?
Yeah, I think so. Just because the Bills were just so irrelevant in the mid-'80s. After Knox left, Kay Stevenson came in, and that didn't really work, and the front office was in turmoil, and they were obviously going nowhere fast. And one of the key moments in Bill history was when Bill Polian was hired as general manager to replace Terry Bledsoe. And Polian was a good, maybe great, probably great, had a great eye out for talent. And he built up the team, and he also picked the right coach with Marv Levy. And they signed Jim Kelly, who had been lost to the USFL a few years before that and had come free when that league folded. And that was really a huge acquisition. And you talk about excitement. This is a guy who landed at the Buffalo airport and drove down the Kensington Expressway to a news conference downtown. And there were people hanging out with signs on the bridges over the highway, waving and honking horns and all that other things just to see Kelly in town. I mean, no pressure, Jim. Just save the whole franchise here. So it was a similar story with OJ, because OJ, as Greg has pointed out, it was considered maybe the greatest college football player of all time once he got done at USC after the 1968 season. And for him to come to Buffalo was an amazing turn of events, that someone like that playing at War Memorial Stadium, which even then wasn't exactly beautiful. And you can imagine how great it was 20 years later. But Kelly was probably the most important acquisition in the franchise history, but OJ had the most exciting story, and that just the fact he was so famous just coming here.
Greg, I'm going to segue off of that a little bit and keep on the Jim Kelly story here. Now, you guys in the book have a very interesting transaction that happened with Kelly and the Bills and the USFL in the Bills offices with a secretary. And maybe if you could share that story, because I had never heard that before. And I had to read it again. I said, wow, that really happened?
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, Kelly was, of course, he had gone to the, he was negotiating with the USFL because he wanted to increase his contract. He was trying to get more money, of course. And the Bills had him into the offices, and he was on the verge of signing a contract. And he was in the offices of the general manager at the time. This is 1983, right after he had been drafted, shortly after he'd been drafted. And a guy from the USFL calls into the Bills offices and asks to speak to Jim Kelly. And the secretary goes into the office and asks, says, "Oh, Jim, you have a phone call." And he comes out, and I think it was Bruce Allen who basically said, or George Allen said, "Do not sign the contract because we're going to pay you more money." And therefore, that was that. Another interesting story related to Kelly that we were talking about at the book launch the other night that Eddie Rutkowski didn't even know. So Eddie Rutkowski was playing in a game in 1968 against the Raiders. And if the Bills lose the game, they end up getting the number one pick in the draft. And if they win, they don't get the number one pick. And of course, the number one pick was O.J. Simpson. And the Bills are trailing 13-10 late in the fourth quarter, and the Bills are inside the 3-yard line trying to take the lead. And Rutkowski rolls out, running toward the end zone, is about ready to score. George Atkinson comes up, hits him. He fumbles at the goal line, and the Raiders recover. And the Bills end up getting the number one pick. And, of course, they draft O.J. Simpson. Well, the story we told at the launch is that fumble that Rutkowski did not only results in O.J. Simpson being drafted by the Bills, it ultimately results in Jim Kelly being drafted by the Bills. So Simpson plays for Buffalo, and he's traded in 1978 for a host of draft picks. And he goes on and plays in San Francisco his last 2 years. The Bills, with one of those draft picks, draft Tom Cousineau, the number one pick in the draft. Cousineau doesn't sign with the Bills. He goes to Montreal of the Canadian Football League. In 1982, he decides he wants to come back. Well, the Bills still own his rights. So they ultimately trade his rights to Cleveland for a first-round draft pick. That first-round draft pick was Jim Kelly was selected.
Wow.
So Eddie Rutkowski texted me after the launch on Thursday night. And he said, maybe that fumble was actually a good thing, and I can feel better about the fumble.
We're going to break away from this interview for just a moment to hear from one of our friends that has a great message to tell, but we'll be right back with some more Buffalo Bills stories from Greg and Bud.
If you have ever seen a sports story on TV or online, or maybe in a newspaper, chances are once upon a time you have seen it before. Hello, I'm Dana Augusta, former sports writer and now podcaster, and I host a show called Historically Speaking Sports, where we place a historical spin on a current sports headline or take the topic that most people are talking about and compare and contrast it through the lens of sports history. In this show, we talk to researchers, authors, and other sports history connoisseurs about what fans and analysts are talking about, yet in the terms of sports history. We also do a weekly top 5 countdown, highlighting moments that pertain to the subject of the show or the 5 greatest moments in the history of sports that took place that week. And to complete the show, we send a shout out to a famous sports figure or moment in sports history that both pertains to that episode or someone who had a dramatic role in sports history or an event in history that fans just need to be reminded of. The show, Historically Speaking Sports, where we put a historical spin on sports headlines. That's Historically Speaking Sports, right here on the Sports History Network.
Hey, this is Del Reed, co-founder of Bill's Mafia and founder of 26shirts.com, where behind every shirt there is a story, and you are listening to the Pigskin Dispatch.
Okay, now you guys have so many great stories to pick from that all professional football fans are familiar with. And that's why this makes this such a great book. And me not being a Bills fan, I thoroughly enjoyed it. And it brought back some great memories. And one was that big comeback game that the Bills had against the Houston Oilers. And you guys sort of segue into that story by alluding to, many people, or you ask if people were one of the many that had left the stadium and tried to get back in. Now, Bud, if you could maybe tell us about that, if you yourself or some people maybe you knew that had left and tried to get back in, what kind of phenomenon was that?
Well, actually, I was covering that game, Darren, for the Associated Press, and basically the Oilers jumped out way ahead in the first half, and the game looked over. In fact, there were a couple of Houston TV reporters that were there for cover the Oilers side of the story, and at halftime they made non-refundable airfares to Pittsburgh the next week because they were so sure Houston was going to go to play in Pittsburgh next week in the next round of the playoffs. And so the comeback starts eventually in the third quarter, and the Bills keep scoring and scoring, and we don't have any idea that people had left the game at halftime and then listened on the radio and said, oh my goodness, we've got to get back in there. But the gates were still closed and people were literally climbing the wire fence outside the stadium trying to get back in. I think, and Greg might remember this better than I would, did Polian finally just say let him in after a while?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
so
I
think he's afraid of people getting hurt.
They were afraid people would get hurt.
Yeah. So I'm watching as the Bills keep scoring and getting closer and closer. And the guy next to me was a gentleman named Val Pinchbeck, who was the NFL Observer, Syracuse former sports information director, and a real class guy. And I always enjoyed sitting with him for games. The second half, as the Bills scored, we just giggled because it was so outlandish. I mean, Jim Kelly's hurt, Thurman Thomas is hurt, and they're coming back, from 27 points or whatever the number was. It was just remarkable to watch. And of course, the Bills wound up winning in overtime 41-38, and it was just amazing. And the one other thing I remember is that all season, I'd been assigned to the visiting locker room at games at the stadium for the Associated Press to get quotes. And usually the teams come into Buffalo in that era and lost, as you can imagine, because they were a great team with 4 straight Super Bowl appearances. And as the minutes wound down, I'm thinking to myself, I do not want to go in the Houston locker room and try to talk to these guys after they blow this lead. And suddenly the boss at the time, Jay Bonfatti, goes, all right, bud, I think we'll need extra help in the Bills locker room. So you get quotes in there. And it was like, thank you. I don't have to ask Warren Moon what went wrong.
You had 2 miracles happen that day then, right?
Yes. I was very appreciative. And of course, Frank Reich came out and read a biblical passage about how all things were possible. And he said, I'm willing to sit here and answer questions for the next 3 days if necessary. He was pretty happy about it all.
I'll bet. I know as a fan watching the game on TV, of course, I really didn't want Houston to win. They were a division rival, and I'm not allowed to root for a division rival at any point in time. So I was rooting for the Bills to win it, and it was just so disappointing. I think I turned it off at like just before the half, and for some reason I turned it back on. It was like the beginning of the fourth quarter. I'm like, oh my God, what happened here? They're coming back in this game. So it was a great game to watch, and even the parts I missed, I guess. Now, Greg, a question for you, and I'm gonna address it to both of you, but first to Greg. Now, with all this great Buffalo Bills history, maybe you could name maybe your favorite high point of the Bills history is, and maybe what the worst low point, the most dismal point of being a Bills fan is.
Yeah, I mean those are actually easy because the high point, has to be the AFC Championship game at the end of the 1990 season when, we beat the Raiders 51-3 and to go to our first Super Bowl, and we were ahead 41-3 at halftime. And so the second half was nothing but a party in the stands because it's like, we know we're going to the Super Bowl. There was no stress. It wasn't, oh my God, are we going to lose the game? I mean, it was just nothing but a party in the second half. So that was kind of a great, probably the greatest moment in Bills history to this point, if you really think of, going to the first Super Bowl. And that team was so good as well. For me, the low point or there's a lot of low points in Bills history, but for a game, it would certainly have to be home run throwback. Or the Music City Miracle, whatever you want to call it. And the reason for me is more personal. I was at the game in Tennessee. I was not a Rob Johnson fan. I was a Flutie fan. I thought Flutie should have started. I don't think the game would have been close if he had. But here you put your statuesque quarterback in against what probably had the best rush in the league. And it just made no sense. But Rob Johnson, drives them down and they get a field goal to go ahead. And the Tennessee fans are congratulating me. All these fans are, oh, congratulations, you won. We wish you luck. We hope you go to the Super Bowl. And then, 20 seconds later, they're then feeling sorry for me. So talking about a swing of emotion. And of course, Tennessee goes all the way to the Super Bowl that year and, is what, a yard away from, at least tying the game at the end. We had the next game was the Colts, who we had beaten the year, a couple of weeks before by 30 points. And so it's like, and then, the other part that's hard is that was the end of an era. That off season, Thurman Thomas, Andre Reed, and Bruce Smith all get cut. So that really ended the era. And then we go 17 years without making the playoffs.
Now, Bud, same question to you. Do you have the same choices that Greg had, or do you have?
I certainly agree with him on the 51-3 game, Darren. And I was in the stands for that game, and I remember at halftime going into the restroom and a loud voice saying, "I thought the Raiders and 34 points was a good bet, but I'm already losing because it's 41-3," and got a big laugh by the people in there. The downside, it's funny. I've got a book coming out soon on this day in Cleveland sports history called Game Day, cheap plug. And the Browns have had their one phrase losses kind of immortalized, the drive, the fumble, things like that. In Buffalo, we had home run throwback, we had wide right, and we also had 13 seconds. And the last one was against the Chiefs a couple of years ago in the playoffs. And the games that really just kill you are the ones you think you've won and you still manage to lose. And the Chiefs game a couple of years ago and the game with Tennessee some years ago probably fit into that category as just the most devastating. It's just you sit there and you're thinking, 13 seconds, 80 yards, there's no way the Chiefs can get down and kick the tying field goal. And one thing leads to another, and they do, and then march down the field in no time and get the overtime win. And the entire town was just like, and now at this point, you start to wonder, was that the closing of the window for the Bills and this bunch to go to the Super Bowl for whatever reason? If they can bounce back, great. If they can't, we might look back at that and saying that was their chance to get to the Super Bowl and they let it slip away. And that's one of the fun things that history does for analyzing a team like this. And I'm sure Greg knows this just as well. We're old enough to remember the trends that you see over the years, and you can point to a moment and say, all right, well, that's where things started to fall apart, or that's where the team started to get good. That's kind of the fun for us to look back and put things in perspective.
Now, I think, and this ties into one of Greg's previous books with the sports curse. I don't think you can say any other team has had as many big gut punches as the Bills have. I can't think of another team that's had, those 3 games that you just talked about, the 13 seconds, the home run throwback, or Music City Miracle, and that wide right. Those have got to be 3 of the biggest, gut punches in NFL history. They're probably making the top 10. And so I figured those were going to be coming up here. So I'm surprised, though, that the one down in Tennessee was the top one for you, Greg. I figured one of the other 2 might be because they're maybe a little bit hit home a little bit harder. But
well, it's interesting, and 13 seconds will live in infamy if the Bills don't get over the hump. But I think both in 13 seconds and in wide right, when those games ended, you were devastated, but the teams were still on the upswing, or at least that was the perception. Like when we lost Super Bowl 25, we were going back to another Super Bowl. There was no question that team was going to go back again. Maybe it wasn't the next year, but they were getting back. They were too good not to. And I think I felt the same way about 13 seconds. It's like, okay, yep, we should have won. It was devastating, but we're the best team in the NFL. And we should be coming back last year. And of course, if you want to play the curse out with all the things that happened to the team last year, I think the reason the Bills lost to the Bengals, they just ran out of gas. I mean, that was such an emotional roller coaster with the winter storms and DeMar Hamlin, and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the 13 seconds becomes bigger and bigger if we don't get back. Like Bud said, if that's the end of this run, that may become the biggest loss in Bills history, because there's no question in my mind that team wins the Super Bowl that year. Them and the Chiefs were the best team by far.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. I mean, I think of all 3 of those, the wide right was a moment as a non-Bills fan where you say, "Oh my God, he just missed that," but great game.
Darren, let me just jump in on that.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
One thing about wide right was, and we tried to make the point in the book, the Bills really asked him to do something beyond his physical capabilities, kick a 47-yard field goal on grass. Hadn't done that all year. And I was watching the game in Buffalo, and when he lined up for it, another sportscaster and I were watching the game, and we both said too far. And he wound up putting a lot of effort and got the ball to the goalpost, but it was just wide right by a couple feet. But really, the Bills' problems in that game I thought they were really outcoached, and the Giants shouldn't have been on the field with them, because the Bills were an absolute powerhouse that year and playing so well. And Belichick and Parcells came up with a great game plan. So, but they came close, but just couldn't finish it. But I think that's a little different than having the victory in your hands, as opposed to a possibility for it, and then having that victory snatched away.
No, fair enough. But the point I was making, you have as a fan of just a football fan looking at it, we had, it's just that one moment, that one play in each of those games in Memphis and I'm sorry. Yeah. Was it Memphis they played a game, or
Nashville?
Where they play? Nashville. Okay. In Nashville and in the Super Bowl. But the 13 seconds game, I think I said, "Oh my God, this team's going to win it. Kansas City's going to win it. Look what just happened. Oh no, Buffalo's going to win it. Look what just happened." I mean, that last 2 minutes has to be the greatest 2 minutes in football history. It was, as a fan, whether you won, lost, or were indifferent to the game, that was a great ball game of 2 teams that really wanted it and did everything they could. And they were both spent at the end of that game. It was the best game I've ever watched, I think, in my life. That was fantastic.
My wife said on 4 different occasions, too much time left.
Really?
At the end of the game. Someone scored up too much time.
Mm-hmm.
And my mistake was with 13 seconds left after we scored the touchdown, I turned to my wife and I said, oh my God, we're going to win this game. So I jinxed us.
Oh, this
Your fault, Greg.
Wow.
Right.
Well, gentlemen, you captured the highs, you captured the lows. You have some great football history, some great Buffalo Bills history. This is an excellent book for any football fan to have in their collection and read and enjoy. And Greg, maybe you could take us on how folks can get a copy of the book.
Yeah, so I mean the book is pretty much available anywhere. So it's available on Amazon. It's available on barnesandnoble.com. It's available in all the Barnes & Noble stores in Western New York. It's available at the History Museum as well as many of the local bookstores in Western New York as well. And in fact, one of the things we're quite proud of on Amazon, it is currently rated the top release of new sports history books. It's number 1 on Amazon in that category.
Excellent. Bud, do you have any final words you'd like to say?
Yeah, we should, Greg, throw a bone to the publisher, Reedy Press, who is will sell you a copy of the book directly as well. But if you just do a search engine, you'll find plenty of outlets. I think it's fair to say Greg and I have both been more than pleased by the reception to this book, maybe a little surprised and a little overwhelmed because people have just loved it and want to buy extra copies, and people that I don't usually associate with football, like some of my wife's friends are buying like 2 and 3 copies as gifts. The power of the Bills is obvious in Western New York. You can go to the malls, and most of the stores, which are having trouble, like every mall, are just filled with Bills merchandise just to get people into the stores. And to see it on a personal basis, to see that enthusiasm carry over, because people just are so enthusiastic about the Bills right now. It's been rewarding and fascinating to watch from close range.
Well, gentlemen, you did a great job on the book. The publisher did a great job with coming up with the concept. You guys executed it flawlessly. I loved it. I think everybody that has their hands on it is loving it. And folks, you want to get a copy of this. So guys, thanks for sharing with the book with us today. And thanks for writing it and preserving that football history. And you're both welcome. I know you both got other projects going on in the football realm here, in the sports realm. So you're both more than welcome on your future projects that are coming on and talking about those as well. And gentlemen, I want to thank you for tonight.
Great. Thank you.
Peeking up at the clock, the time's running down. We're going to go into victory formation, take a knee, and let this baby run out. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you back tomorrow for the next podcast. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. A special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, Sports History fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I wanted to thank you for stopping by to listen to another episode here on the Sports History Network. Our podcasters are passionate about uncovering and sharing sports stories from yesteryear. And if you didn't know it already, we have over 30 shows across the network covering all sorts of sports history topics. In fact, here's a glimpse into one of our awesome podcasts here on the network.
Each week, the official Football Learning Academy podcast will take you deep into the history of pro football through interviews with players, coaches, or administrators in the NFL, as well as interviews with Pro Football Hall of Fame selectors, authors, and historians. You'll learn how the game evolved and important moments that shaped the sport into what it is today. And don't miss the Pro Football History Nugget of the Week. Listen to the official Football Learning Academy podcast on the Sports History Network.
How about that? I bet you're super hyped to go listen to that new podcast, right? Well, to learn about this show and all the other podcasts on the network, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com/podcasts. Again, That's sportshistorynetwork.com/podcast. Head over there today to find your next favorite sports history podcast.